Hello and welcome to Unit 2. So this PowerPoint is going to have a wide variety of topics that are covered in it. Everything's kind of put into one area with the exception of the one Prezi, so that you have everything in one and it's a little bit easier for you. You can have this playing in the background just as audio and just go through the PowerPoint. So the first one is Eurocentrism and imperialism. So Eurocentrism is a worldview where Europeans are considered to be better than non-Europeans. So this is a bias system. So this system says that white European Christian culture is better than other cultures. So we talked about this when we were looking at residential schools, and we've gone through this definition in Unit 1. So this is just a reminder of what Eurocentrism is. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So the British people were the ones who had the biggest reach when it came to imperialism. So if we see the British Empire in the 1920s as depicted in this map, this shows us how big their empire was. It was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had so much land, right? And so it wasn't just Britain, it was lots of other countries, mostly European countries, but countries from all over the world, trying to get more power. And this could either be through diplomacy, so talking and trying to make accords and agreements to get land, versus military force. Usually it would start with diplomacy. If that didn't work, then they would use military force. The British had the best weapons, so usually they won out. So when we're looking at the next slide, it's the Columbian Trading Empire, and this was named for Christopher Columbus, who was an explorer. And this was a widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World in the 15th and 16th centuries. So that globalization, right? The spread of all of that stuff. And this was about European colonization and trade. And there were invasive species. So there's communicable diseases. So things like bringing smallpox to Canada, right? So we know about some of those. And the cultural exchanges and transfer of people, both free and enslaved between continents. The new contact between the global population circulated a wide variety of crops and livestock, which supported increases in population in both hemispheres. Although disease initially caused declines in the number of indigenous peoples in the Americas. So if we're looking at the map, we can see the route that was taken and the trade route that was going between the Americas, right? So between Canada and the United States, that we know as Canada and the United States now. The three main reasons for imperialization and colonization was gold, God, and glory. So gold, literally gold, physical gold, but also diamonds and rubber and other sorts of natural resources that were, as the Europeans saw, there for the taking. So they saw the natural inhabitants of countries as less than, right? Because they're looking from a Eurocentric point of view. They see everybody else as less than them. So they don't necessarily see themselves as going in and stealing somebody's gold or diamonds or whatever it is. They're not really seen as the same kind of humans, so it's not really stealing, right? For glory, for having a lot of land, right? The more land that you have as a country, the more power that you have, the more resources that you have, the more people at your disposal. So there's a lot of glory in being able to plant that flag, like in the picture, and say that this is your land. And then the third reason was religious reasons. So they believed that their Christian religion was better than other religions, whatever religion or spirituality was present in that country. And we've talked about this in Canada in the context of our First Nations people. And so they thought that they were coming and they were bringing God to civilize these people. Whether it was Africa or another continent, they were coming to bring their religious ideas because they saw them as better. Again, that Eurocentric point of view that everything European is better. So this really kind of came to a head when it came to Africa. It took them a long time to kind of get into the center of Africa. At first, it was just kind of on the coastal regions, so you can see on the map there. And they were kind of going for the land, and then they realized how much resource there was. So rubber was one of those main resources. Excuse me. And then they discovered gold and diamonds and all sorts of things that were worth a lot of money. They also discovered humans, slaves, and that they could make a lot of money by taking people from the land and selling them off, bringing them to North America and other places. We're going to talk more about slavery. The PowerPoint, or sorry, the Prezi has a whole section on slavery in there as well. So when it came to Africa, the continent was split amongst the various European countries, and there was only a couple independent states. So if you look at the colors on the map, you can see each of the countries that had chunks of the land. So Britain overall had the most land, and then you can see France had the biggest chunk altogether. And then we've got Portugal, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and then our small independent area. So they had a Berlin conference. So in Berlin, they went and they had a conference to split up Africa without inviting any Africans. So there was no African countries that were actually present at this, and they had no say in how their land was split up. So the British, they had the biggest technological advantage because they had things like machine guns, which were new weapons, but incredibly powerful and could wipe out large groups of people at one time. And obviously they're also very intimidating. So they're scary. And local people are kind of going, ooh, that's a really scary weapon. That's a big deal. And so they are more likely to give in. There is a YouTube video there. So pause me and watch that YouTube video. It is quite interesting. It goes into colonization and slavery and the resources. There's some graphic pictures in there and things like that, so just beware of that. So the next slide is on the Silk Road. The Silk Road was an ancient network of trade routes that connected the East and the West. So the next thing you want to do is the Silk Road worksheet is in D2L. So download it. Look at the questions first so you have an idea of what kind of information you're looking for in the worksheet. Read the worksheet, go through it. I like a highlighter. And then answer the questions, and you can submit that on the D2L assignments area. The next slide is barbecue area. So there is 2 videos in there. One is a satirical, so a funny, humorous kind of ironic video about Australia. And instead of having the European settlers come in and colonize Australia, it is set up as if it was white people living in Australia and Aboriginals coming in and colonizing Australia. So watch that. I don't want to give too much away. It's an interesting sort of spoof on a role reversal of what actually happened. Then the second one is a very quick heritage minute about the naming of Canada. And I want you to think about, why do we use satire, so humor and irony, to talk about a serious issue when we're talking about difficult topics like colonization? And how is barbecue area video similar to what happened in Canada? So the next one goes into the next assignment, the Beothuk and the Micmac. So there are 3 sources here that you can look at. There are other sources you can look at on the internet. There's a slideshow put together by a professor, there's a video, and there's a website. Again, you can just Google both of these groups and you'll find lots of information. And you want to think about how they're similar and they're different. And how are they connected to imperialism? How does Eurocentrism fit in there? How does globalization fit in there? And why do we care? Why do their stories matter? So think about those things, complete the worksheets, and then submit it into D2L. The next assignment is Avatar. So go through the questions first. It's on D2L. So you know what information that you're looking for, because there's lots of information and it's a fairly long movie and it's fairly complex. Watch the movie. You can get it on Amazon Prime, Netflix. You can get it from the public library. There's tons of places that, because it's a little bit of an older movie, you can find it in tons of places. Watch the movie and answer all the questions on the sheet. So some of the questions are going to be easier to answer while you're watching, kind of pause and write your answer kind of thing. And then you're going to submit that onto D2L as well. The next slide is the Australia Colonization Project. So this is your main project. This is worth 25% of this unit, okay? There's video and there's a sheet on it. But the premise behind it is that you are a convict, so you're convicted of a crime. You live in Britain and you've been sentenced excuse me, to hard time, but the prisons are overcrowded. So instead, they ship you off to Australia. And Australia has recently been colonized by the British, and it's deemed as a great place to house the criminals, so they can lower the British population. So you set sail from Britain to Australia and you land in Botany Bay, so on the coast. There is a video clip here, and it just kind of brings you through that story of the actual story of this happening. And so you're going to want to watch that video. On the project sheet, it'll explain what you're supposed to do, and there's a video that explains what you're supposed to do for this project. And remember that this is the biggest project in this unit, so it's worth a fair chunk. So you want to make sure that you follow the sheet very carefully and you put the right amount of effort in. So the next slide is on again, we're shifting gear, is on sustenance. So that means the necessities of life, nourishment, food, provisions, support for life, endurance, or strength. So all of those things that sustain us, that keep us going, whether that is physically, so food and exercise and relaxation and all those things that our body needs, or it could be emotional things like love and spirituality and religion. It can be things that like feed our soul, going out into nature or art or whatever those things are for you, entertainment. So there's some of them kind of listed below there on the bottom of the slide. It's all the things that keep us going. And then if we look at material property, so there's 2 kind of cartoons here. There's the first one, and it's a very, very cluttered bedroom with stuff everywhere, and they're in bed. There's 2 people in bed, and they say something is missing. And they're basically hoarders. The entire space is filled. And the second one says, Celeste is into plants, and I'm into books. And there's half the room has plants on it, and the other half has books, ceiling to floor, and again, it's really cluttered. So we have material property. We have all of these things, right? And part of what drove colonization and all this stuff was the want of material things, right? Because we like to have stuff. Which brings us to the next slide, which is on intellectual property. So the protection of creations of the mind, which have both a moral and a commercial value. So we've got the copyright symbol there. When we have things that are our intellectual property coming from our brain, so if we create music, if we create a book, if we create an idea and an invention, we can copyright that and it becomes ours, and we are the people who get the financial gain from it, and somebody else can't do that. So that's why it's illegal to download music without paying for it, right? The cartoon says, here's my new invention. Oh, look, it's like mine. And then somebody else is pulling out a third one and it looks the exact same. So it's just talking about, that creativity that we have and that ownership that we have over our own property. But sometimes, it happens. Same ideas. So when we're looking at cultural intellectual property, Indigenous people's rights to own and control their cultural heritage. So the idea that when your culture comes up with something, and we've got a drumming circle, and we've got henna, and we've got the dragon, and we've got the dances with the outfits, and all of these things belong to that cultural group. And what is their cultural intellectual property, and their rights to be able to control that themselves. Which brings us into cultural appropriation. So, cultural appropriation is basically taking something that belongs to one culture and appropriating it. So taking it on for yourself. Now, there's cultural appropriation and there's cultural appreciation. So sometimes it's really hard to know the difference between those two things. So we have a couple of pictures here. We have at the top left, we have two gentlemen wearing headdresses, and that's cultural appropriation. They've got cheesy sunglasses on. They're at some sort of festival. They're not well done headdresses. They're costumes basically, right? We have Katy Perry in a kimono singing a song. Again, cultural appropriation. She has nothing to do with that culture. She doesn't even mention the culture in the use of it. We have somebody wearing a turban, a model wearing a turban as part of a walk down the catwalk. And then we have blackface. So this was something that was popular as a form of entertainment. We will still see blackface occasionally. Which is when a white actor, and you can see the white actor, would dress up in black, and this would be done as a way to have a minstrel show, so a show where they're making fun of and exaggerating black culture. So cultural erasure is erasing the history of a culture. So by wearing costumes, let's say at Halloween, where you're a Pocahontas, an Indian princess, or whatever it might be, it's sort of erasing the history of that culture and just sort of taking it on and making it into something to make fun of, right? So there's a couple videos here that I would like you to watch on cultural appropriation, what it is, and how it can impact people. And there's a quote here that says, "The line between celebration and appropriation gets crossed when there is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, or ideas of one group by another, typically the more dominant group. It comes down to whether you're aware of a look's cultural history, whether you give credit where it's due as opposed to renaming the style, and how you honor whatever you are borrowing." So it is okay to appreciate a culture and wear something from another culture when you are coming at it with knowledge. So there's kind of 3 rules: educate yourself, be respectful, and ponder your privilege. So know what you're wearing. There was a whole controversy a couple years back about wearing cornrow braids when you're not part of an African culture, because that is traditionally part of an African culture. And so if somebody is wearing them and they're not part of that culture, it can be cultural appropriation when it's being done in a way where a couple years ago they were calling them Bo Derek braids, which was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed actress who wore them in a movie in the 70s, and it wasn't giving due credit to where that tradition actually comes from, right? So educate yourself, know what you're wearing and why you're wearing it, and what the significance is behind it. Be respectful about what you're wearing, give credit where credit is due, and then ponder your privilege. So a lot of the controversy around cultural appropriation is that if a Caucasian person or white person is wearing box braids, they can get away with that and somebody can say, oh, that's cute. But if somebody is actually black and wearing those, they're seen as uneducated, or that they are going to be less intelligent because of that style choice, when it might just be to keep your hair out of your face. It's, you know, it's got a function behind it. There was a reason that it was worn originally in Africa, and so you have to be very careful because there is privilege behind one group being able to wear something and another group not being able to wear it. So again, shifting gear. So if we're looking at society and culture, there's integration, separation, assimilation, and marginalization. So is it considered valuable to maintain cultural identity and characteristics? If the answer is yes, it could be integration or separation. If it's no, assimilation or marginalization. Is it considered valuable to maintain relationships with other groups? Yes, integration or assimilation. No, separation, marginalization. So the chart sort of explains how they kind of come together, and then we'll kind of go into the definitions. So again, this should be refresher. When you did your Unit 1 vocab, these words were in there. So we should kind of know these ones by now. Cultural assimilation is the process in which a minority group or culture comes to resemble a dominant group or assume the values, behaviors, and beliefs of another group. So if you look at the pictures, we've got the American melting pot, right? We've got all these different groups coming together, but they're assimilating. They want to become part of that main group. So they're just Americans. They're not, you know, Italian American or Mexican American or whatever. The next one's a cartoon that says, we're a very tolerant society, but if you don't behave like us, you can go back to where you bloody came from. Right? So the idea that we're tolerant, will not accept but tolerate you, but you just have to be the same as us, right? Marginalization is the rejection of one's culture of origin, so being on the outside, being on the margins. So the idea that your culture is not as good as the dominant culture of whatever country you've come to, and so you give up your culture because you are on the outside. Then we've got the next one is integration. So cultural integration is a form of cultural exchange in which one group assumes the beliefs, practices, and rituals of another group without sacrificing the characteristics of its own culture. Integrating cultures, so several cultures coming together to form a new multicultural society. Each culture keeps its character, features, and values. So an example of this would be Canada. So we consider ourselves to be a multicultural society where everybody gets to bring their pieces of their culture together, and we integrate it into a Canadian culture, which isn't just one culture, it's multiple cultures coming together. And one group can have their culture without having to sacrifice to become Canadian. So you can, in Canada, let's say like in Calgary, we have all sorts of different clubs, right? So my family belongs to the Danish Canadian Club. So we can still have our Danish culture, but still be considered just as Canadian as anybody else, right? We've got a picture here. We've got a group of Filipino immigrants who have like a Filipino club, and they're proud to be Filipino, but they've got their Canadian flags and they're proud to be Canadian, and they can have both and they don't have to give one up. So accommodation, the next slide, refers to the process by which individuals may take on values and beliefs of the host culture and accommodate them in the public sphere while maintaining the parent culture in the private spheres. And this can also be in the public sphere as well, that people are allowed to have their cultural practices or religious practices, whatever those may be. And this is just to protect cultural rights. So in Canada, we consider Canada quite accommodating, especially compared to some other countries when it comes to different cultural practices. The next slide is on homogenization. So this is an aspect of cultural globalization listed as one of its main characteristics and refers to the reduction in cultural diversity through the popularization and diffusion of a wide array of cultural symbols, not just physical objects, but customs, ideas, and values. So remember in Unit 1, we talked about this a fair bit, and how universalization, right, or homogenization, and we've got these ideas. So we've got this picture here with McDonald's, and it shows how many McDonald's there are in the world, or not how many, but how many countries have McDonald's in them. And the vast majority of the world is red, indicating there's McDonald's there. And there's very few places that don't have McDonald's in them, right? And everybody knows that golden arch, right? We talked about that in Unit 1 and how popular that symbol is and how recognizable it is, right? And we see this same culture across the world. So again, switching brain gears, it's all globalization, but it's all different aspects of globalization. So we've got globalization and women. And we've got this picture here, and it's of a woman, and she has duct tape, and we've got disposable and cheap labor written on that duct tape. And we're going to talk more about what that kind of means. So the first look is at participation in the economy. The world economy has drastically increased with globalization, and women's participation has increased overall, more in some countries, less than in others, right, depending on the social rules of that country. But there is an 18% wage gap. So men earn 18% more than women on average. In some countries, it's dramatically more that men earn than women. But there's very few countries where there's an actual equality. But there are more female entrepreneurs than there have ever been before. So we are starting to make some strides in equality, but we still have a long way to go. If we look at participation in the workforce, we can see that participation in the workforce has gone up. Nothing super dramatic. From 15.6 to 16.6% from 1977 to 2005. But we do know, statistically speaking, the more that women engage in the workforce and in entrepreneurship, so building up businesses of their own, the better a society does in general. Countries that are led by women or have a really high percentage of women in politics tend to have better economics, a higher workforce, lower prison rates, lower teenage pregnancy rates, higher rates of healthcare success. So we know that building up women actually builds up a whole society. So there are two videos here. There's one that's on female garment workers in Bangladesh, and then there's one on women in Saudi Arabia and women's rights. And there are some dangers. So we know that there is workforce slavery, especially when we're talking about countries that don't have a lot of laws that protect women and girls from things like working really, really long hours in dangerous conditions, that sort of stuff. So there is a lot of dangers to globalization and increasing women in the workforce as well. The next slide is on representation in the political process. So we have a cartoon here, and this is on Kim Campbell, who was briefly a prime minister in Canada in 1993. And the words say, a perky, blonde, sort of conservative who is big on style and glamour but little on substance. Gee, how can we possibly fail? And this kind of talks to the fact that when she was in power, the conversation wasn't about her politics. The conversation was about her hairstyle and her clothes. And it was done in a way that was quite demeaning. And it took away her power as a politician and put her as somebody who was just seen as somebody without substance. And it was really unfair. and we have not had a female prime minister since, and it was quite brief. So as of January 2013, the world representation of women in parliament was just over 20%. So that's a really low statistic, right? The next one says countries that have had female heads of state. So if you click on that, the list will show you, it was just updated in 2019. So it'll show you all of the countries that have had female prime ministers, presidents, leaders of state. But most of the female leaders have been interim, like Kim Campbell, for short periods of time. Some countries have quotas saying they have to have so many women in politics. So they are a little bit more balanced. It wasn't until Trudeau came into power that we had our first gender balanced cabinet in Canada. So if you click on that link, it's to a newspaper article from the time when that happened, when Trudeau was first in power. You can read about that. The next area is education. So more girls are going to school than ever before, but still significantly less than boys going to school. And girls tend to achieve a lower level of education than boys, statistically worldwide, not necessarily in Canada, but statistically worldwide. And the poorer the country is, the less likely a girl is to get any education at all. So some might get elementary level education and some might never enter a school whatsoever. In several countries, it is seen as a waste of resources to educate girls because they're just going to go and stay in the home and they aren't going to do anything with that education. In many areas of sub-Saharan Africa, girls are at increased risk of being physically and sexually assaulted on their way to school. Not just sub-Saharan Africa, all over the world. Unfortunately, we know that girls will fall victim. And so there is 2 videos that are next. They're fairly short. And they're on educating girls and the difference that it makes. So we know, again, statistically speaking, the better women do and girls do, the better society does in general. Okay? So the premise behind them is educate a girl and she will change the world. They're both quite good videos, so give those a watch. And then this brings us into modern day slavery. So like I talk about in the Prezi, which you guys will watch after, there is an extension of slavery. Slavery never ended, it just sort of changed. So human trafficking in the United States, they estimate between 600,000 and 800,000 people trafficked across borders each year. So a lot of people who are human trafficked will go between Canada and the United States. Trafficked in Canada sent to the US, or trafficked in the US sent to Canada to make it harder for the police to track them. And they're often forced into labor or sexual exploitation. Women can be lured into slavery through the promises of employment as shopkeepers, maids, nannies, waitresses in developing countries, and then they're forced to work off their debt by prostituting themselves. So that would be the international component. There is also the local component where local girls are trafficked into sexual slavery. It's not just girls, there's boys that are trafficked into sexual slavery as well. It is incredibly difficult to prosecute and stop, and sentences are very short. It's not usually a huge punishment for what is a very devastating crime. There are 2 YouTube videos there of women who have been trafficked, and so they can be hard to watch. Okay, there's nothing too explicit or anything in there, but it's hard to hear these stories of these women whose lives were basically ruined and they had to rebuild themselves afterwards. So we know that 80% of sexual trafficking is women. So it is primarily a problem that impacts women. The next slide is on child brides. So we can see some pictures. Girls as young as 5 being married off to full-grown men happens across the world. And if you think it doesn't happen in Canada, you are wrong. It does happen in Canada as well. So we've got a couple different pictures of child brides on the next 2 PowerPoints, and it happens across the world. There is a video that talks about the practice of marrying off child brides. It is somebody who was married off as a child, and she talks about her journey to coming out of that marriage and kind of finding herself. And then the next slide is, why does this matter? So what happens in the world of women changes the world for all of us, right? The gender gap directly impacts us here in Canada. Women earn 87 cents on the dollar in Canada here than anywhere else, than men. And girls here in Calgary are being recruited for sexual slavery. Forest Lawn is actually at the center for Calgary when it comes to sexual slavery. We know that there are people who go to school in various high schools across Calgary, and we know that they are actually sexual slaves, and they're still going to school every day, and they're still living their lives, and their family has no idea, or in some cases they do, and this is occurring across Canada. So it's not necessarily somebody who is kidnapped from their home and taken and sold in another country. It can be happening right under our noses, and we know that it is, and it's very difficult to prosecute. Canadian women in general are more likely to have a university degree than men, but they still hold jobs where they make less money and have less power. So this is still something that really impacts us. Even though women have more education here in Canada, they still make less money and have less power. Something to keep in mind. And men, this matters to you too, because do you want your daughter to grow up in a world where she is valued less than her brother? The last thing on the page is a video clip with Reese Witherspoon, the actress, on what do we do now, and I'll let her speak for herself. And that is the last slide in Unit 2. And thank you for going through the PowerPoint. Bye, guys.